I guess that was basically it. So that's under section 7 in your manual, agricultural water. Sorry, section 7 in your manual, agricultural water. The focus in the Canada Gap manual is really on your knowing and protecting your water source. As Colleen mentioned, that water testing is not mandatory but highly recommended. And in the appendices, way at the back, somewhere, there is information on, there's a tab on water testing, and it goes through some considerations for testing your irrigation water source. So if it's a running source like a river or a stream, you know, some recommended frequencies that it should be tested more frequently, or versus a well, and you know it doesn't change very often, and that kind of thing. So section 7 is pretty straightforward, focused on protecting your water source, particularly if it's something that's under your control, like a pond or a well, making sure that you know what's going on out there, that if you have wildlife issues that you've kind of taken some action. One action might be testing. If you've got birds nesting, there are things that you can do to discourage them from that area. Buffer strips that Colleen mentioned around the edges of it, again, if you're using your own pond. So what it asks you to do is do an assessment of your water source and check for all these things that it lists on this first page in section 7. And then if you find some of these risk factors, you need to take some type of preventive measure, corrective action. And you would document that here on kind of the next couple of pages in terms of what you've done about it. And again, testing because if you think you've got a problem, it does say then you should test in a lot of cases. So if you know that you're using a river and upstream your neighbor has cattle, and you know that he or she lets those cattle, you know, they use that water, then the only thing you can really do is test it to see what you can find. And so the information on testing, there's some guidelines back here, but again, they're only this appendices, these resources, they're examples of things you can do, and they're not the only way to do them. So you might find additional references from other places. The other section then, getting into the post-harvest water, is section 15. It's called Water for Fluting and Cleaning. So that's the section that covers everything from washing hands, washing and cleaning equipment, and anything that is used to wash or produce after it's been harvested.
So, because I misunderstood this. So when you say agricultural water, you're referring to water that you're going to call not potable water.
Right. So agricultural water is this Canada Gap term for anything used in the field, basically, like for irrigation, for spraying, that kind of stuff. It's not the post-harvest water.
So if you're not using that, then you can say non-potable.
Right. Yeah. If you don't irrigate, you don't spray, non-potable.
TJ, I think too, and I believe there's a copy of the CCME guidelines on the US listed. I believe it also refers to it as agricultural water on that list. So just
yeah. And that's sort of another thing I just want to mention about this Canada Gap manual. There is a glossary because the terminology used in this Canada Gap manual may not be the same as other people use in various places. Be it OMAFRA, be it the US, be it whoever. And I sat in on some of the working groups where they decided what went in this manual, and people from all across Canada, some were growers, some were government people, and there was huge arguments about what do we call this, and it should be called this, because in my place they call this, so at the end, they had to make a decision, and they put it in the glossary. So that's really some of these definitions, and like where the glossary becomes really important is, when we're talking about agricultural water, there are very specific requirements for agricultural water that are very different than the requirements for water that's used for fluting and cleaning. So, that said, let's go to section 15, which is water for fluting and cleaning, because, to be honest, this is one of the most confusing sections in the whole book. And not just for producers, I train auditors and I work with them all the time, providing, guidance and so on. And This is one of the areas where I get a lot of questions.
I'm sorry, what section is it?
15.
So greenhouse water has to be water for cleaning and cleaning.
Greenhouse has a section on agricultural water where it talks about their irrigation water.
Okay.
Yeah, and then so it has different requirements for greenhouses in that section.
Under agricultural water.
Under agricultural water still. So agricultural water is the irrigation and spray water. Water for cleaning and cleaning is basically anything you're doing, any cleaning, I guess, cleaning of hands, cleaning equipment, cleaning of produce, fluming. So basically, and maybe this might be a good one if we're kind of into one of our working sessions later to sort of be working through, and that way I can answer individual questions, because the thing with this kind of water is there's so many different scenarios and people are doing so many different types of things that the section is quite confusing. So basically, what Colleen though already told you is that you need to test your last water contact with the produce. You need to test your hand washing water and your equipment cleaning water. You need to have 0, 0. So, I mean, there's other situations where if you're fluming and you have a final rinse at the end, you don't necessarily have to add a sanitizer, however, into that flume water, but it's still a good practice, as Colleen said. If it was up to me, it would all have to be potable, it all have to be sanitized, but it's not, that's just personal opinion. So anyway, I'd say, I'm not going to go through this because Colleen already talked about most of the stuff with water, but if you have questions before you go for your specific operation, it would be a good chance to ask me at some point later today or tomorrow. And then the other section in here that's related is the ice section, which is section 16. And it talks about making sure if you're making ice, it's from a potable source, and you're getting ice tests, which is you're melting the ice and getting it tested, not just testing the water used to make the ice. And if you're buying it in, getting either a letter of assurance or a water sample, or water test results, or ice test results. And this is one of our auto-fail items in Canada. So if you can't prove that water's potable for the things that they're supposed to be potable, then it will fail. It's an auto-failure.
It has to be 2 waters, that's for sure.
You have to have 2 for sure. If you had 1, you wouldn't fail, you would just lose marks. So if you have 0 water tests for your water for fluming and cleaning, you would fail. Okay. Any questions? All right. That's it for that.
I don't know, is there any, I guess you kind of addressed it as far as, like what you see as an auditor, some of those things, but.
The biggest thing I see as auditor is just people getting confused on where they need to take their test from and when they need to get their tests, or not getting that first test before the first start. Like you're supposed to test it before you start for the first time, just so you know that you're starting with potable water. So that timing is difficult. And then because it's a generic program, right now it says 2 tests for everybody, even if your season's like 3 weeks long that you're using the water for. So we're working with the Canada Gap, the scheme, about giving us a little bit more leeway to make some of these judgment calls in terms of, if they're only using water for 2 weeks of the year, do they need to have 2 tests, 1 at the beginning and 1 after 1 week? And is that, or can we let them get away with 1? So those are kind of the main things.
Like you said, the rules are usually work our hands, and then contamination, whether it be water is a very common one because water is used for a lot of different things. We've got a lot of different applications, and I mean, unfortunately, sometimes because the water can be so variable, or so many things can contribute to the quality of it, it's really hard to manage it if you're not, and to assess it, because really water tests too. Even though they give you a great idea of sort of what's going on, it is only a moment in time. And that's the other challenging piece of it, right? Because sure, your water's great right now, but maybe 2 days, you all of a sudden have a huge rain event, right? Now the water test maybe isn't representative. But again, that might be sort of a flag saying, okay, I've had like massive rains, I might need to retest it. So I will talk more about that, but again, it's just one of those things that, though you're right, it is a very common thing for where there's been a food-related incident. Okay, tracking forward. Okay, our learning objectives, they're pretty much, I don't want to say carbon copy, but, we're looking at risks. What are we doing to reduce those risks? And, why it's important to people. So what are the risks when we don't properly clean and sanitize? We've addressed this as well. Contamination can happen at any point in your operation. Anytime food comes in contact with anything, there's a risk. So it can happen at any stage. But one of the main reasons, and that massive outbreak with the kennel was as a result of poor cleaning or like production environment hygiene. So that relates back to cleaning and sanitizing practices in the premises. So unsanitary production environment, dirty surfaces, you might have a lot of debris or like mess around, even pooling water. It's something that maybe people sometimes might not think about, but water, even in the summer when they say, make sure you're removing any standing water, whether you have like tires laying around for mosquitoes. Same thing, it's a breeding ground, right? So if bacteria gets in there, same premise. So I have an infamous picture of the Jensen farm equipment that was part of that contamination or the kennel outbreak. So we've talked about, obviously it's that transfer of pathogens and the contamination and why that's important. So there again, there's other areas where contamination can happen. If things aren't cleaned, but just keep in mind some of those things that can really impact that. So that's if you have equipment, if you're using harvesting tools, so you're like cutting knives or cabbage or broccoli, those can be an issue potentially. Or for clothing, we've talked about that. Footwear, those harvest containers. I like to add this picture in here because this isn't uncommon in harvest. And I realize that and it should be in your book as well. So what it is, I think it's harvesting melons, and this individual worker is in the harvest bin, and you might not toss the melons to people, you might put them on a conveyor belt, but the more important issue here is this, right? So you think, okay, so this could be potentially a market-ready bin, right? Often people send bulk bins to the market, to the Toronto terminal, farm gate, whichever it might be. And yes, I realize we don't necessarily eat the rind of some of the melons, but cantaloupe, for instance, is one that's a high-risk one. Most melons are, but they've been identified as sort of a high risk because of their skin and their texture. So when we think about this, we say, okay, well, he's clearly standing in the bins, and what's on his feet? Boots, dirt, right? Now, where was he before? I don't know. Was he doing something in the livestock field? Was he shoveling bedding? Was he applying manure? Was he in there right from the get-go? Who knows? Again, it's a risk. There's different things that could be maybe done to reduce this. I realize usually those bins fit very exact on those 2x2 side by side. There's not a whole lot of room, but again, it's just identifying that there is a risk, maybe whatever, but it's not good practice, and then you need to consider that these bins could be harvest ready material as well, so they need to be cleaned and kept clean at all possible. So be cognizant of your surrounding environment, and again, any other implications, if there's animals or livestock or whatever in the area.
Now, when you're talking about Canada Gas,
Yes.
Because we have that, we throw cabbages to people standing in bins, in bins. That's what we do. Yeah, and that's what you do. And then they're placed in the bins. Now, how would you write that up?
Maybe she would.
I would suggest, what Canada Gas recently had suggested to some other growers was having a dedicated pair of bin boots. And so that they could, that they're not, to get into the bin, they would wear their bin boots in the bin, but then they would wear their regular boots, watering the fields and that thing. So, it's not something
maybe with cabbage a little bit, not as much, right? It's growing around.
Yes.
It's more that what's, again, like Colleen said, what was that person doing before? So he's coming from home, he looks at, we're at home, and he's, does he have pets, does he have livestock? So again, having those steps.
That's a great suggestion.
The same concept, right? Some facilities, they have like those little sliver booties, right?
Yeah.
More in processing, but yeah.
Mine is, realistically, you can't be washing wooden bins, like it's not realistic.
No, so an easier way would be to clean a pair of boots, one every once in a while, and make sure that they were dedicated to have that. Yeah, or you had, maybe a tote with a dip bath or something, but yeah, that's much better, keeping a clean set of boots with the trolley, right? So when we talk about improper cleaning and sanitizing, there are, obviously it's, if you don't have those measures in place, things can get out of hand, mainly bacteria pathogens. But you can also introduce chemical hazards, and even though that's not the focus of what we're talking about today, I wanted to include this, and yes, this is a processed product, it's margarine, but again, just to show you that issues can happen. This is a recall that it was initiated because they thought there was cleaning chemicals. It's not what they thought, but there was found to be cleaning chemicals in that product, so they had to recall it. So again, that was, we're going to get cleaning chemicals from the process lines that you're using. So again, it was just to bring it, it can happen. So when you think about cleaning and sanitizing, what are often the things that happen? With that type of, if we're looking specifically at that process. And typically, if we're not doing the process properly, or we're not doing it at all, that's always a fact. And we talked a little bit earlier, way early on, like that was still today, but that was a long time ago, about biofilms, right? So biofilms can happen, and they don't happen instantly, but over a period of time. And if you don't have regular cleaning, like a regular cleaning, I mean, you schedule, this is when it's happening, this day, this day, this day, it just allows for that opportunity for bacteria to sort of get into those areas and for them to start to take up home there, and then that's where you can get bigger issues. So again, it's a regular cleaning schedule and making sure that it's happening all the time. Another one is not using the chemicals, either the ones that are approved for use or not using them properly. So that involves, if you're not using them, say again, like I talked about, you can use chlorine in like a dip, like a wash tank or as a dump tank, but you can also use it in a spray bottle, which is a very common method, but the concentrations would be different. I believe I have a slide later on that shows those differences. One might be 100 ppm, the other one might be 200. So again, it's being cognizant of how you're using it and what's required on the label of how you're supposed to use it. Also the concentration, that's part of that. But even that product, just because it's great to use for one application and it's a sanitizer, doesn't mean it's great, that's approved to be used in that other application. So, just be cognizant of what you're using and how you're using it. And it's always important to follow the label. And we have a little exercise on that in a little bit. And then not using the proper equipment or tools. So an example of this would be, especially more, I'd say, I guess any facility or any food production environment, but a facility is a good one to use. So you might have like your pack house facility. So you might have broom, dustpan, whatever, cleaning stuff. But you also have washing facilities, right? So you're going to have probably a broom, dustpan, some other probably very similar tools. So you would want to make sure that you are keeping those items in there. You want to have one that's designated for the toilet area and one that's designated for your fresh product area. You don't want somebody using those cleaning, a scrub brush that they would use on a toilet on, say, your wash bed or your chain grater. Just an example, but that's just an example of where you want to make sure that the proper tools are being used for the proper purposes. Our infamous case study, we're finally here, of the cantaloupe. So we've talked about it, we've talked around it a little bit. So in this particular case, this was a couple years ago now, and this is kind of what sparked the, oh my gosh, we've never had listeria in cantaloupe before, and now it's, that's a major concern now for cantaloupe, and listeria everywhere. It's kind of was that push it, and why now listeria, testing and, environmental swabs and that is kind of on the rise, and making sure that, this is part of our surveillance. But in this particular example, case study, the contaminant was listeria. And what had happened, it's probably better to go right to the life cycle here. So what had happened, so we're producing cantaloupes in the field, we're bringing it into the pack house. This particular equipment had been previously used for a different agricultural product. So that was one issue. It's not that you can't do that, but it just wasn't maybe necessarily the best design for this, and an older design. So the older design made it very difficult to clean, get into all those nooks and crannies and properly clean it. But as well, there was other issues within the facility, and maybe we'll go back a little bit, the inside the facility was quite dirty. There wasn't evidence of regular cleaning. There was a lot of buildup of debris. But the other thing that, and I think the lady in the back had asked about that, or someone up front, sorry, I apologize which one it was, but about the outside bringing the practices inside. And what it was is when they took all their waste, like their culls and that from the product, they would take that over to a livestock and feed that to part of their livestock. So the truck that they used to do that was the same truck that left and came into the facility. So, and then they parked the truck close to the facility. So when they went to the livestock field, they had all like dirt and whatever, and the guns on the tires. So then that was on the close to the exterior, and then as people and forklifts and that came into the facility, it dragged some of that contamination from the livestock area into the premises. So would that be a big issue with someone with a regular cleaning and sanitation? Probably not so much, because you're taking care of it. But when you have cooling water, and then you have this sort of influx of organic load and stuff happening in your facility, and then you don't have cleaning to get rid of it, it's just it's just building. And so that was part of the issue, that sort of brought it in, and then over time it just sort of spread throughout the whole facility. And so when they went into we'll back up a bit. So when they produced the cantaloupe, went to a packing facility, and then widely distributed across the United States, which you see down here, like everywhere. And so people started to become sick, and then eventually, you start linking it back to, well, what did you eat, and so forth. So they initially linked it back to the distribution facility, which created, wiped out all throughout the states. And then from that, they were able to identify that the one farm is where this issue was happening, and that was through the packaging and whatnot that they could identify that. And then when they finally figured out where the farm was, they went to the farm, and then now they started to do a lot more digging, doing swab tests, environmental testing, product testing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they found several strains of listeria, but especially the one that was linked to these people that were getting sick. And so you can see here the impact of this. So 28 states were affected in this outbreak. 31 people died, there was a miscarriage, and then again, the reported illnesses, almost 150 people were confirmed ill, and you can see where throughout the states where it sort of impacted everywhere. And then what happened, some of the key factors, again, there was this old, hard to clean equipment, so that wasn't cleaned very well. Just the sanitation in place wasn't the greatest. Even the floors and some of the other surfaces were, porous, just weren't easy to clean really well. A lot of dirt, debris, cooling water, again, was just promoting, a great environment for bacteria to grow. And then, like I said, there was that huge evidence of that they didn't have a regular cleaning schedule. So I made this point a lot earlier about the local distribution system makes it very easy for one mistake to get very widespread. In this case, it's very evident very quickly. Something like that can happen. Yes, ma'am.
What would you consider a regular cleaning schedule, like once a week and once every day, like for a building like that big?
And there's different requirements to set up by the standards. I think depending on what it is, sometimes it's once a month. If it's an item, say like a toilet hand washing facility during production, I believe it's daily. once a week. It really depends on the equipment and how you're using it. The standard might indicate that, but I think there's a minimum basically like once a month, but I'm not sure.
For buildings, it's once a month, for most equipment, it's weekly, but then from your own experience, you might find that you need to do it more often, just because of, certain products are dirtier, you might have more stuff.
Flying in the face.
Exactly.
Yeah. I spoke to this a little bit, like, because of this incident, listeria surveillance has drastically increased. Just as a general statement, pathogens are changing. We know about these superbugs. We know that, there's different strains of E. coli now, and it's just part of the fact that in this particular case study, the farm has declared bankruptcy. I also think up until recently, if not still, they're under house arrest. The auditing facility was named in that because the facility, I think, a week or two prior, had been sort of certified that they met the standards, but that might just be a little bit of negligence there. But the broader scope of this is that people died as a result of this. The economic losses, the commodity suffered greatly, still suffers, because now people are high alert. Oh, should I produce cantaloupe, or what do I do? There's that. It's just, the industry is truly scarred for life because of this. And again, it'd be horrible if that was, your facility, or if you were associated with that product. And I can't say it enough. Just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it won't. And that's really why we're here today, just to be able to say, hey, what can I do to make things a little bit better? So, when we look at cleaning and sanitizing, they do play a significant role. Yes, ma'am?
Sorry, just to follow up on this case study, were there any changes then made to the certifying practices? That was my interest initially when I asked about the auditor, and not so much, who is at fault, but just what, among the lessons learned, obviously this area is going to be, more carefully certified. Were there any other sort of protocols that were changed as well?
That particular facility is no longer, they're bankrupt, but I know, like with cantaloupe, and maybe you can speak a little bit more to this, but I know with cantaloupe, even for example, in the Canada manual, they're no longer required, like they don't suggest submerging them, it's just like a half submerging, because, so that, we talked about the constricting and bringing stuff in. Even some cantaloupe, people do like what they call a dry pack, so they don't have water at all with regards to cantaloupe, again, just to reduce that. They might use like a dry brush or some sort of brush just to get some of that, the dirt off. But I don't know if Khadija could speak any more to that.
Yeah, those are two of the main changes to Canada Gap that came out of it. I know that the folks at Canada Gap are doing a lot of work with some researchers down in the States, in California, who are kind of experts. They've dialoguing back and forth on what needs to be changed and how they need to change it. In addition, Costco, I know they changed their requirements. They're now requiring a test and hold policy on cantaloupe. So you can't ship to them cantaloupe unless you have tested the actual cantaloupe for listeria. And they increased their swabbing requirements for farms as well, to swab their equipment and their walls and stuff. So there have been changes for sure.
But they haven't made it into the GFSI or the...
Not specifically, just some general ones on cantaloupe, like washing. And that would be it.
And listeria is a tricky one too, because listeria is ubiquitous. It's found everywhere. So it's, again, the nature of the beast, at least like with equipment too, it'll tend to kind of get into those nooks and crannies, and it'll stay there for a long time. And you'll often find it's when you dislodge it or take it apart or disrupt it, and then all of a sudden it's like, woohoo, party, right? And it goes everywhere, and that's where those issues happen. So again, it's that regular cleaning and making sure that you don't get kind of that debris and build up. And if you are starting fresh, talk to someone about maybe a proper design of equipment to make it so that there are these areas that are difficult to clean, or if you can take the piece of equipment apart, to really do a thorough cleaning on it to make sure that to reduce that potential for something like that happening. With cleaning and sanitizing, especially when it comes to food contact surfaces, they really need to be on a cleaning and sanitizing schedule. It's really just the best practice, and then that way, you know, again, you're eliminating any of that potential for risk, or at least mitigating the risks somewhat. So there is a difference though between cleaning and sanitizing. Cleaning is that removal or that physical debris. So that's stuff that you can see with your eyes. So if you think back to hand washing, or you know, it's getting rid of that initial dirt. Because sanitizers, in order for sanitizers to work properly, they need to have that direct contact with a surface, and in most cases, an actual extended contact period, and sometimes it's upwards to like a minute, not just a spray and wipe sort of situation. So again, friction, time, all those things come into play. So whether it's your hands or a food contact surface, you know, a lot of those same principles, some of those same principles apply. Again, I think it's section 17 or whatever it is, or 15 in the manual that, you know, it's cleaning that we're talking about, you need to have potable water because you don't want to be introducing any more contamination or spreading the contamination around if your water source is level. And it is always the first step in the cleaning and sanitizing. Again, get rid of that debris so that you have a sort of a bare surface for the sanitizer to work with.
For farmers who are on board doing their thing, and what if their equipment is not conducive to water? Like if, you know, they say, you're gonna rust out all my stuff, like, do water lessons.
There's two things to that. It kind of depends on, so Canada Gap, they leave it a little bit open for you to determine what's appropriate for a piece of equipment, which in some cases is not great, but it's it's like, how do we tell people they have to clean and sanitize everything when there are actually some things that cannot have water, and certain types of machines where it's actually not good to introduce moisture into the process. So to make a one-size-fits-all thing that's appropriate for everybody is really challenging. So they kind of left it open. They want, there's going to be some options: dry cleaning or water friction or water and sanitize, or cleaning and sanitizing kind of thing. So if you can't use water in your system, you kind of have to have a good reason, and if it's just because your equipment is not cleanable equipment, like you can't clean it because then that's not, like your equipment needs to be cleanable. So if it's something that can reasonably be cleaned with soap and water, that's for that industry, then that should be, you know, clean with soap and water, should be cleanable. So you're having rust issues, rust problems, but that's going to come up as well. Because if we go and see that you're using equipment that's, you know, got serious rust problems, then that's a potential contaminant as well. So basically, the point of what I'm saying is that it's kind of open to you, and when we go out there, we want to see that you have some type of written procedure, and we also look at your equipment to see that you're following your procedure. If it looks like the procedure's working, we look at for build-up, we look for you know, is there stuff building up in the corners? Is it cleanable surfaces? You know, like the packing line's not made of wood, or has any carpet on it, or anything strange like that. Be surprised.
And sponge rollers.
Yeah.
That's another big one, right? Because sponges. Just think about it, that's a nifty little cellulose membrane for bacteria to have a party in, because you can't sanitize. Very difficult to sanitize a sponge. So, you know, there's a lot of rollers that will be padded, right? Because they don't want to harm the product. But if there's padded with sponge, then they're wet, they're gross, but they're full of goo.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. So that's a big one. I know in a lot of facilities that use that type of roller and that type of equipment. So. Yeah. Okay, so the difference again between cleaning and sanitizing. So sanitizing is that the process that's going to then reduce or kill the bacteria to an acceptable level. There are typically two types of sanitizing methods. So you can use like a sort of a chemical solution. You know, we talked about some of those items, or you know, there are the UVs and stuff like that too. Those are kind of considered sanitizer treatments, but this is more chemical based. Or the high temperatures, and that can be like in your dishwashers where you have that really high heat that's going to help sanitize some of the items as well. But typically we're looking more at the one that where you're using a chemical type solution or a sanitizing product to do that for you. Right. sorry, again, I should have learned from my first three, that this is a PDF, so it doesn't show you the little animation. So basically the animation, which probably would have made some people happy, but so basically what happens here, you have the wash with the cleaning detergent, and so you have all your contamination here, or the bacteria attached to the surface, and you get all this dirt and debris. So you're washing your detergent, it's going to loosen that debris, take it away. So then now, and then when this rinse happens, you can see this physically get up and move. And then it leave all these little green goblins there for the sanitizer to attack. So that's what the sanitizer is doing here. And then these guys are turned, and then they're gone. And then this is what you're left with after a good cleaning and sanitizer process. So basically, a level of, I don't want to say contamination, but an acceptable level that can be deemed suitable for good cleaning and sanitizing. So the effectiveness, when we talk about sanitizers, and I talked about it a little bit before with regards to chlorine and how it gets bound, the sanitizers are affected and can be negatively impacted by a few things. The organic matter is one, and we talked about that a little bit. But even water properties. So some people might have very hard water or high pH, low pH, hardness. All those things can either, bind, because again, it's like organic matter, right? So the sanitizer can either bind if there's, like, say, a lot of lime or calcium in the water, or they just might not function properly, like the pH ions and all that might not work. So water properties can affect it, and then that contact time. An absolute minimum, but it will say on the label that you're using what is required for the type of, how much contact time, but minimum, unless otherwise stated, should be at least 45 seconds of that direct contact of the sanitizer with that contact surface. So this is the table I was referring to before. So using chlorine as an example. So say this is if you're sanitizing or wanting to sanitize some of your harvesting tools or your knives. So this is a sanitizer sink. So you could potentially use 100 ppm in the sink and then submerge that cleaning equipment in there. But if you want to use chlorine in sort of a spray bottle application, you would have to actually bump it up to 200 parts per million. With some sanitizers, that's the upper limit that you can use before it needs to be rinsed with potable water, like a potable rinse. So often below 200, but again, I think you'd have to read the label. It's usually okay to leave and let it dry. But if it's above that, then depending on what you're using, might need a rinse afterwards. For organic production, so here's some options. And then as that gentleman was saying, I think there was one that was no longer, was it the hydrogen peroxide? There was one that you were saying that is now removed. I think you said it as of 2014, it was the hydrogen peroxide.
It's no longer on the CFIA list.
Okay, so again, good to make note of what is acceptable and what's not. And unfortunately, in your situation, you're finding some issues is trying to find one that's going to be suitable for what they want to do. But it is important to know what you can and can't use. So keep that in mind. Some suitable methods. You can use a brush and bucket. And notice how I say brush and bucket, not sponge and bucket. So that very easily to be used in the field or the pack house. Again, potable water, some sort of detergent, and then the proper tools and the sanitizer. Pressure washers can be used outside. You do not want to use a pressure washer anywhere indoors, especially like if it's, if you're going to have food in that net. You shouldn't use it in because of the aerosols that it creates. And there's been many situations you think, you're spraying the dirt all over, and then it's just flying everywhere. So you had your dirt sort of in one spot, now it's everywhere in your facility. So pressure washers really aren't ideal to use inside. You need to use them outside. And also their effectiveness will depend on the water quality. And they have specific settings too, the temperature, the pressure. So all those things that you need to account for as well when you start to use equipment to do some of those things, and always follow the label. So when we think of contact surfaces on the farm, these are some examples of where, that you might have, might be applicable to your farm, might not be, but just some examples. So sorting grading tables, harvesting containers and tools is a big one, packaging materials, transport containers, that's one, that can be on a vehicle, the big transport container, but it also can be, the containers that you might be using, to take to market or whatnot. So some other areas, maybe considered maybe non-food contact, but they would still need to be cleaned and sanitized. General work areas, floors and walls again, in that Jensen Farms. It was the whole facility that wasn't sort of following that regular regime, so you have to make sure that everywhere is clean, because there's really no point in cleaning just one spot, everything else is dirty, so it's just going to eventually get re-dirty and re-soiled. And then just, it's important to make sure that you're also paying attention to areas that you might not always consider, like machinery and vehicles, and that's especially important with those harvest vehicles or those harvest wagons. So it's, sorry, I don't know why that's all squished up there, but there's 3 areas that we tend to like to look at for the cleaning and sanitizing sort of process. So your SOPs that you're using for it, the products and how it's supposed to be used, and then your equipment and your tools that you're using in that create your cleaning and sanitizing program. So I haven't really used this terminology a whole lot. I know Katija used it a little bit, SOPs. So these are your standard operating procedures. If you think back to that sort of procedure template, same sort of thing that I showed you, where it's good to use sort of like one universal template. Basically, it's just that step-by-step instruction, that sort of, the recipe, if you want to say, that if someone goes and takes that procedure, they know exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it, what tools they're going to need to do it successfully, and any other additional information that they need to record that information. So this step-by-step basics, that's just an example, that you might do. So remove large debris, make a visual inspection, and then go through that process. Frequency is very important. Again, you think, okay, I cleaned it today, and we had a question about frequency, but once a year, that's really not ideal. In the pack house or whatever, once a month might be suitable, but for equipment that you might be using daily or on a more regular basis, once a week, once a day might be required. So it's really important to, 1, make sure you're matching the requirements, and then 2, as an additional step, meet the requirements, but make sure that you're also meeting what your operation requires. So if you have a product that's really dirty and dusty, you might want to amp that up. Again, it might be daily or every second day for you, even though the requirement says once a week. So just keep those in mind. So food production areas and surfaces, so some of those things that are listed there. High risk areas and toilet and hand washing facilities, and we understand why now. These things that are listed here, like the food production areas and surfaces and toilet and hand washing facility, these require daily inspections and more like a higher frequency of cleaning and sanitizing during those high production periods like harvest and that, because again, that's where you're going to have that more, the higher opportunity for that direct contact with the product, so you want to make sure that you're really keeping things as clean as possible. If you go to set out to use a product, make sure that you really look at what it is that you're using and why you're using it. You want to make sure that the products, sorry, I didn't realize that was off kilter, but you want to make sure that that product's approved and acceptable for not only sort of the operational use, but its intended use, meaning more specifically like spray or like a tool sink or a dip sink if you want. Is the brush and bucket acceptable, or does it need to be used in a different way? And then the concentration that needs to be used in. So, like I said, on that USB stick that we got to make sure we get to everybody, I think it has the full link on how to do it. I would typically just go with this and then do a search and it'll bring up the same information. On that reference list of material, you can do it a few different ways, by the product or by the actual generic name, whichever way you want to do it. It's a reference list, and those will be approved, a reference list for the essential materials. I've said this enough too about making sure that you follow the label, how it's supposed to be used, the concentration, and another important thing that kind of goes by the wayside a little bit because it's not directly related to food safety, but a very important component is these are chemicals and they need to be stored properly. They shouldn't be just sitting on a shelf somewhere and You know, they should be sort of segregated, not in the food production area. They should have their own storage space and preferably locked with appropriate signage to incorporate items. Oh, this is our exercise. So, at the back of that discussion table, you're going to see this sort of flip out long page. So it's an equal scary back. Okay. So as you see it there, yeah. So I want you to have, hopefully it is big enough. I try to get them to print it big enough that you can actually read it. But there's a couple things I want you to do. You can talk about it in groups or by yourself if you want. Try and answer these questions based on this label. So this is a quaternary ammonia liquid sanitizer label. So there's some information there that you can try and find. And basically it's just to work your way around the label and just to see what kind of information that you can find on it. So take a couple minutes and just see if you can answer those questions that are up there on the brightly yellow corner slide.
For chemicals and so on,
Yes.
I know on a farm, or I understand on a farm they don't need WIM sheets, but if you have a packaging facility where you do almost non-farm, do you need WIMs?
It's interesting that you say that because when I was responsible for the quality management system for the producers that shipped to us, they needed to either have them at their farm, the WIMS labels, or have access to them. So I don't maybe
Access to?
so we would provide them a link, or at that time we managed the quality management system. So when Katija was talking about that group system, and you have the internal auditing of the people that are in that system. So we housed that for the producers, but now they've moved it over to a different option so that each producer gets audited every year and they're responsible for their own stuff. So they no longer have that quality management system. So by doing that, each producer, again, this is for that particular food safety program that they're following, they have to keep their own WMIS requirements. Now, Katija, I don't know if you heard the first part of that question. The gentleman asked about having WMIS labels. I don't think it's mentioned in the Canada Gap, but I know, again, where I used to work under the quality management system, they were required to have those things on hand. So there's some, and then this gentleman, sorry.
WMIS is not mandatory on farms, but some of the companies like Lawrence and Sobeys, when they're buying things, say that the farm has to have WMIS on it. So the buyer, to be part of their GAP program, they want them to have the WMIS.
No, it didn't, well, I've never.
I learned it's just WMIS string, yeah.
WMIS is not mandatory on farms.
And it's not the WMIS that you're really looking for. We have to have this if we're using it on the farm.
Yeah.
For the GAP program.
Yeah, for the chemicals that you're using.
Yeah, for any chemicals that we're
You
using.
have the label.
WMIS has really nothing to do with GAP.
No, so you're because I know, so for the applicator spray course, right? That talks about your different hazard signs and that, and so you need to be aware of what those were. So that's why this is a great example of knowing what your program requires if you're following one. Again, from my experience, the producers that I worked with had to have it, but we were also supplying to the UK, so their standards are a little bit different.
Right. That standard covers environmental, worker
Worker
welfare.
it covers everything,
all
not just
that.
food safety.
Yeah.
So there you go. But I mean, the thing is, you should, and as far as for worker welfare, you really should have your WMIS labels for any products that you're using, because if there was an issue, then people know what to do, the proper first aid measures, right? But again, it is worker welfare, so.
I think you need them for health and safety, which is a whole other.
Well, and that's what I thought too, but, yeah, again, for that whole other volume.
Don't. No, it's
So-
just industry labor, it is not mandatory.
So that's where, yeah, see, so I'm not,
Everybody has to have a self-help and safety program
Yeah,
that you have to sign off on.
yeah.
And Witness is gonna, yeah.
You had to have a health and safety program 4 years ago.
Yeah, we do, but
What you have to have by July 1st, certification that they can talk to basic rights.
we had to find everything on our farm, including WD-40 and have a wind machine
Right.
5 years ago.
You told me that.
Oh, that's been legislated a long time ago.
I'm talking right to the Ministry of Labor.
But as far as gas is concerned, if you use it on your thing, you have to have it.
yeah, I think it's a good, regardless of what program it's under, I mean, I think you should always have your health, your hazard labels, accompanying any products that are on your farm for if there was an issue or a situation, because then the proper first aid measures can be in place.
An example for me was when I had my pre-audit, I used a hand sanitizer on the wagon. That was not a normal one that the lady had never seen, because I had issues with my poor guy was getting raw hands from using hand sanitizer. So I went out and purchased a cream hand sanitizer. And she did not know whether that was food safe. So because I had the product label, then
Yeah.
it did me good to have it so that I could prove to her that it was GAP.
It fell under the food safe. So there's a non-straightforward answer for you. So I think the best practice is if you have access to those labels to have them on hand, so that if there was an issue, then that would be the best practice. But I guess there's differing requirements. But again, the thing where that comes into play is more worker wellness, and this is food safety. So, but the most important thing is to keep them segregated from the food. You don't want them sitting on a skid or in an open closet in your food production area. That is one area, one thing that would be covered off, right? Like as far as keeping your chemicals in a proper storage location. So, sorry, I guess that wasn't quite clear. But so I don't know if you had any chance to look at this, but we can just go through it as a group. So you have this big label in front of you. So what's the intended use of this product if you look at the label that's provided?
Very sanitary.
Sanitizing equipment
Yeah,
in a food processing plant.
right? Can it be used on any type of food?
No, and that means
On eggshells, that's right. Can be used on eggshells, but you don't see anywhere else that it can be used sort of in,
so it's not food safe, then, is it?
it is, like it says, you don't want to contaminate food. You can be used in eggs, but typically not, like it is usable in those type of environments. It says it somewhere about,
The no rinse sanitizer.
yeah, so you don't have to rinse it, so it can be, as long as it's dried and, then it can be, but there is a risk of food contamination if it's applied directly to the
If
product.
it's swallowed or anything like that, so if it's ingested, there's a warning about that.
Yeah,
So it isn't food safe.
that's right, but it's food contact safe, so it can dry ahead of time and you can't use it sort of to dump the product in and go ahead and eat it, right?
But if it says to use during processing, like isn't that when you have the vegetables going through it?
See, it's for sanitizing the equipment.
Not food.
No, because the intended use for it is for sanitizing equipment, not for running your food through.
Yeah.
Oh, so it's saying you're processing without food in it to run it, kind of thing? It says during processing apply blah, 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 level to conveyors and ecolabers or the feeding system?
So on your equipment.
Okay,
Yeah,
but you can put it on eggs. right?
on the shell.
On shell.
But I mean, people typically don't eat the eggshell, right?
No, but they, yeah, sorry, I'm not getting it.
But again, there's kind of that kind of weird example, right, where you can clean your equipment and it can dry,
Gotcha.
but if it was wet, I'm sure if you dunked your egg in it and then when cracked it, then there's a potential, right? So just some other information that you can find, we identified that, if you use it below 200 parts per million, you don't need to rinse. There's different applications and different parts per million, so you can identify that. I mean, it says on, for the one for in the meat and poultry, that you can use it during processing for 200 parts per million. And it's food safe for food contact surfaces, but not for direct food contact, if that makes any sense. So just another example of where you can find that type of information, but that those labels are very important when you go to choose to use a product and how you're using it, because just because it's suitable for one application doesn't mean it's suitable for another. So equipment and tools, that kind of leads us into the next part. No sponges, they're yucky. Again, make sure whatever you're using is suitable for the application that you're using, whether it be the chemical or the tools. The example I used, it's really important that those tools are designated and labeled and kept for those applications. Face it, things are expensive. There's a lot of different applications. I'm going to put it out there, producers are very resourceful and will think of many ways to use one item. But this is a case where you really do want to kind of, especially if it's in a packing facility, if you have toilet facilities, just make sure that you at least at a minimum have separate ones for the toilet facilities and something different. Yes?
When you just said that, I didn't realize, I thought we'd get in trouble because we were using watermelon bins for garbage because they're baked ground or whatever. And then the gas lady said as long as they're marked,
That's right.
then you're on.
Yep, exactly. And I mean, again, because you don't want then someone else to go back and use it and say, okay, I'm going to now use it for water. Same thing. I know the big macroplastic bins, if they were found on premise, I don't know about Canada Gap, but the program that we were following at the time, if an auditor saw that, that was not good, because that's a thing that they'll use it for storing wood, scrap pieces, you name it, and then try and use it for harvesting when they're following the season. So that was a big no-no. So it's just, again, habits, right? But they are great bins for a lot of different uses. About the same size as the picnic, actually. For little kids, I'm just kidding. So again, suitable for use. I'm not going to go through all of this, I've talked about it, but here's a good, companies do this now. They have color-coded equipment. So you can have red for the toilets, green for the facility. Or what we did we just got colored tape and put it around the handles. So we had green for the facility, and then red for the other areas that were not suitable. Really great idea to have, obviously, that designated storage area locked, hopefully with not direct access to the pack house. And then more desirable is, if you're going to use some sort of cleaning, scrubbing tool, that it not be a sponge, that it be more of a hard bristle type apparatus. And then, again, just a little bit, when it comes to specifically training your workers on cleaning and sanitizing, there's that infamous template again. I can't say it enough. It's just, you can use whatever you want, but I just think it makes it easier for people looking at that type of information if all that information is in a standard location. And then some of this resource information. This is just our website, so there's good agricultural practices where you can find a lot of information. Most of it will be on the USB sticks that I provide you. There is a cleaning and sanitizing guidebook. I believe it's on the USB stick. We'll double check it as a PDF form. If you wanted a hard copy, and I apologize, I didn't bring the example, but I can. We'll just see. I won't go back to the office to get because that's the opposite direction. But there are like an actual booklet of a cleaning and sanitizing booklet. It's just a booklet form of this PDF version that should be on your USB stick. So I'll double check and make sure that that's there. And do that. You're done. So, party.
Do they understand what they're supposed to be doing? And is what they're doing matching up with what your written procedure is? And this is one of the areas where Canada Gap asks you to actually write out how you clean and sanitize your equipment. It's going to be different depending on who you are. So I'll be looking for, build up, is your equipment build up of dirt? I took off marks the other day at an audit just because they have these big harvest wagons, and some of them, like half of the one facility, they're all nicely branded and painted, but in the other one they were harvesting into, and it was, the paint chipped off on the inside, and there was, some rough spots, so then again, that's could be the chipped paint could get into damage the product, and the rust too, it's not a very good cleanable surface. And then the other thing I look at is, again, looking at the label, whatever it is you're using for cleaning and sanitizing, are you using it properly? We see a lot of people who, their procedures, if they're using it at a concentration that requires a final rinse, but they're not rinsing it off. And the other thing I see is that you might be hiring someone or getting like Ecolab or somebody to come in and set up your cleaning system and provide you with chemicals, and sometimes the salesperson will say, well, it says you gotta rinse it off, but you don't. Like I've heard anecdotally about things happening. They say, well, we're in the process of getting that approved by CFA, the no rinse. You don't really need to rinse it even though it says so on the label. So it's okay if you don't. But as an auditor, I don't know. All I know is that it says on the label that you have to rinse it off. So we go by the label, isn't it? You have to go by the label too, unless you have some really good evidence from CFIA that says that they'll accept it there. So.
And maybe just a side note too, if you've created a procedure based on a specific chemical that you're using, and then you go and change your chemical, get a different supplier, you need to address that in your procedure, because then the teachers can go, well, this was made for Steribac, where's the Steribac cup and you're using Ponto 500 or whatever it might be, right? So that could be an opportunity where, you might not, it's a small change, but just because, there just might need to be some adjustments, that's all.
Any questions?
Which sections of Canada Gap pertain to this cleaning and sanitizing?
So under equipment, section 8 is where it talks about for pieces of equipment, how often they need to be cleaned and sanitized. And then section 9, I think, talks about chemical, like the actual cleaning and sanitizing materials. It's like a test. Equipment, yeah, and then cleaning and maintenance materials. So yes, So 9 is telling you all about, what to purchase and how to use it and where to store it. And then section 8 on the equipment is like for your various pieces of equipment, how often you have to clean it, what it needs to be made of. And then it differentiates between the equipment used in the field versus used in the packing house, and then also handheld cutting and trimming tools. So like knives, if you're using for harvest, they need to be cleaned and sanitized daily. But most other equipment, it's minimum weekly. But again, some people may need to do more.
Any appendices that are pertinent?
Sorry?
Any appendices that are pertinent?
Yes, there is one specifically on that CFA reference listing. So it basically refers you to that.
How to make a chemical solution. I think that's in
Yeah.
Yes, and then there is one on, which one is that? There's one on chlorination of water has at the very end of it, appropriate parts per million for cleaning equipment. So I think it's 50 to 100 parts per million of bleach, like your standard bleach, in parts per million in water to do a basic sanitation solution. And then there's also a section, I believe, that lays out some of the best practices that Colleen kind of already has on reference materials too, on cleaning first and then sanitizing after. So removing all that organic matter first, using friction and water, and then following up with some type of sanitizer.